was listening to Asra Nomani speak. She's an Indian Muslim journalist and author. And she said on the topic of caste, she said that there was a certain establishment of the Muslim population which has used race to create this concept of Islamophobia. And then they use that to hide or to shield some of the more extremist views. They're being funded by Soros type of organization. George Soros is backed organizations like Open Society Foundation. There are governments that are involved in this, like the government of Qatar and Turkey, potentially. And she was saying that the Hindus are now in the crosshairs of their agenda. So they've introduced, or they're highlighting the issue of caste, and it's being used to pit one group of Hindus against another group of Hindus. And what are your thoughts on that? Because, I know you described it as being another ideological weapon, and in the past you've talked about caste as being a weapon of mass destruction. Can you share how you arrived at that and just educate our audience as to what are the parallels and what could that mean going forward?
Well, let's approach it from the point of view of extortion and fraud. Simple criminality. Let's keep it nice and simple without getting lost in lots of academic hypotheses. So here, caste has been pushed forward on the basis of a report. It was produced by an organization, a for-profit organization called Equality Labs. A case started, and that case is now known as the Cisco case. And so the two things, the existence of a case and the existence of a report, were used to give credibility to the assertion that caste is endemic and it's rife. A reasonable person would assume that if the report was demonstrably undermined and found to be not worth the paper that it was printed on, everything would collapse because it's one of the foundations for the whole thesis. A judge refused to accept the report as evidence. He said, "No, I'm sorry. This is not evidence, right? This is a polemic. This is just a string of words, word soup thrown together, looky-feely and all that sort of stuff." I said, "I'm sorry. This is not evidence." So that disappeared. The case itself has floundered because that case was built on straw-manning an individual and then literally crucifying the individual for 3 years in the stocks, in the public gaze, dragging that straw man into court, and then trying to establish that it was guilty. So you create the straw man, and then you establish that it's guilty. But the evidence that's emerged established that the straw man was a complete fiction as well. So those are the two bits which have been the foundations for this whole exercise. The worrying thing is that having revealed the report as being completely fraudulent and inadequate, and having had the case itself fall apart because the evidence was, again, absent, but there was such an element of collusion in what the Civil Rights Department did. They colluded with the plaintiff and concealed evidence, refused to look at evidence, they refused to deal with both parties equally, etc. And those factors, when you take them into account, it comes to a position where you think there is something institutionalized here. They are not looking at the evidence, and yet they're still pressing ahead with it. And that is the issue that I think really needs to be dealt with, because what's happened is hatred and contempt for the Hindus has become seeded to such a degree. The evidence and the reasons and the justifications that were given, they've all disappeared, but the flavor has stayed. I was speaking with one of the employees of Cisco, and she was describing a visit to a supplier's site where the supplier had said, "Oh, hang on, you're one of those casteist Hindus at Cisco where all these problems are." And yet, this is completely unjust. The old boundaries, we always rejected group guilt, that if a member of a particular group is guilty, the whole group is not guilty by association. It's a nonsense. It doesn't withstand legal scrutiny in principle. And yet that seems to be now accepted as pervasive and is part of this woke approach. The other thing is ancestral guilt, right? And suddenly you can become guilty, as this individual Sundar Iyer was, because of his ancestral name, Iyer. and they allege that sometime in history Ayers did unpleasant things, and therefore he is responsible. So ancestral guilt and group guilt have found new manifestations in this new woke world where reason, facts don't matter. What you feel is more important, especially if it gives you power. Does it give you power? Yes, it becomes a reality. And these cannot survive. They cannot withstand the passage of time. There are still enough good people in most societies who will come together at the appropriate moment and recognize that this is a threat to everybody, not just themselves as individuals, but the system itself when it targets a passive, tranquil minority, as it is doing here in the case of the Hindus. It suddenly starts to spark off red flags. And we're seeing this. With the conference, we have got some excellent participation from the African American community, and their experience as being the recipients of American justice over centuries and generations, it lends a certain, shall we say, credibility to their opinions. And they've stepped forward saying, no, the Hindu community must resist this because it's a principle that becomes a problem for all of us. Members of the Jewish community, another minority, are also stepping forward. So people are beginning to object to it, but the state itself seems to be doubling down. It's digging its heels in, and it's passing the most ridiculous clauses, stage by stage, committee stage by committee stage. And the most recent clauses that have been passed, if you read them, you can see legal principle A, out the window. Legal principle B, out the window. Legal principle C, out the window. There are no legal principles being honored and respected in the clause. And it's actually very worrying because one thing they did is they removed the references to South Asia. It started off Journey as being targeting Hindus openly. And now that it's gotten to this stage, they've removed the references to South Asia, but what they've introduced impacts upon every American. So, for example, they alleged that Hindus are endogamous. Okay? And therefore, the way to break this casteist endogamy is to insist that they cannot determine how their group members choose partners. And we're seeing this is a nightmare in the Indian scenario where the SC/ST Act is being used to infringe upon the right of the freedom of people to choose their own partners from their own communities and communities who they resonate with.
So you're
This
saying you
particular
can't
clause,
marry who you want?
well, this particular clause says that if any community chooses its partners in a manner which excludes others, then the law can intervene, right? And they have used the caste notion to get this law onto the books, but it impacts upon everybody. So all of a sudden I'm thinking, right, so when the Jewish community say we prefer to marry with members of our own community, they would fall foul of this, right? When the immigrant community from anywhere, the Mexican community, socially and culturally, they resonate with each other, there are shared commonalities. If they choose to marry within those spaces and they hold events, or they create institutions or establishments, shadi.coms and so on and so forth, each and every one of them becomes grist for this particular mill. And it's just passed through 11 voters, 9 all supported the amendment, 2 abstained. So that's an 11-0 decision against excluding this nonsense. And yet it's gone through. On the other hand, the Supreme Court has just rejected the notion of affirmative action in its entirety. So now we have truly a Samudra Manthan underway, and hopefully good will come of it. But the fact that it can happen, and especially to a community which assimilates and integrates, dharmic people, we look at everything as our Karam Bhumi, and so we perform Karam wherever we go. What more could you possibly want? And yet the state institutionally has targeted them. And it's the impact on the individuals who are being targeted is very significant. But more worrisome is that America used to have some amazing statesmen. There used to be litigators who were towering intellects. You read some of the decisions that Supreme Court judges made, or some of the people who followed the founding fathers, their aspirations. They were statespeople, they were people of substance, not these tantrumites who put something together with no concept of principle and certainly no vision of consequence. It's, we've got to get it in because it sounds like a good idea and we'll pick up the pieces afterwards. No, as Abhijit said so eloquently, grifters.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.